is just share this screen and welcome everyone to our community update for Macmillan Precinct. Welcome back to those that have recently joined us and also to those who might be new to tonight. Welcome to the new age of webinars. I'm Xander Cameron and I work for Roberts Day. We're the consultancy firm that's been appointed by the town of Vic Park to assist in preparing the master plan for this project. And with me I have Kevin and Andrew, as well as representatives from the town of Vic Park, Jack, Haley and Ellie, and we've also got our consultant team representatives as well. Before we kick off, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land and respect past, present and emerging leaders, their continuing cultural heritage, beliefs and relationship with the land, which continues to be important today. I thank them for the contribution made to life in the town of Victoria Park and to this region. So we've got quite a lot to get through tonight. It'll be a lot of me talking, but we'd like to get some feedback from the community as we go along as well. So I'm just going to spend a little bit of time rehashing for those that haven't been part of the process to date to give you an update on where we've been. We're going to spend about 10 minutes going through the community feedback specifically, and then we'll open up to a Q&A session where we'll address some of the questions that have come through via chat. We'll then talk to some of the preferred scenario direction that we're looking at based on the feedback that we've received so far. Again, have another Q&A session and then wrap it up with next steps. So just to clarify, in terms of a webinar, the cameras are all off for a webinar. I can see Dave. It's actually nice to see another face. There he goes. But effectively, it's just me talking. The session will actually be recorded and shared. And we do ask for questions using the Q&A function as we go. So what we'll do is if you can, whatever question pops up, if you can actually type that out as we're going, and then we'll come to it through the key sections and talk and answer those questions. And at the end of this evening, if you've got any further information or questions, we'd welcome you to please submit those via the Your Thoughts website with the link below. So just as a rehash, why are we actually planning? The town needs to be thinking about meeting the needs of a larger population. It's also about renewing the community services and facilities that are ageing. We've heard very strongly about protecting and enhancing the green space and trees from the community. And this whole exercise at the end of the day is also about responsible management of town resources. In terms of the timeline and where we're at, during February through to April, we pulled together a vision and priorities with the broader community. In terms of an online survey, we had a range of listening posts, interviews and a vision workshop. We then had COVID that hit, so we had to change track and we looked at appointing a working group. So in May and June, we've been working with the working group to explore different ideas through a whole series of virtual design workshops. And here we are now in July, where we're actually working on in terms of deciding the direction with the working group as well as the wider community to review the scenarios that we've worked up and getting some feedback on surveys. So the working group comprised of 20 community representatives, including 10 site stakeholders. And as I mentioned before, the early work that we did, we came up with a vision and some principles. All that information culminated into a vision and principles, which was agreed by the community, but also workshopped and endorsed by the working group as we proceeded as well. So we're using this vision and principles very much as the guiding framework to inform our design. So it's probably worth just touching base on some of those key elements again around better connecting people, buildings and council services, really looking at bringing in the cultural and natural resources so that they're more accessible to the community, and providing a welcoming space with immersive green spaces and a real mix of uses that can shape a unique destination into the future. Along with that vision, we had a series of principles which have been shaped by the community, and they are green forever, a space for all, mixed together so that the site really blends in well with the Park Centre and Albany Highway and Kent Street, and also very much about celebrating character. So it's about the collection of different facilities that can bring people together and celebrate what's special about Vic Park. So this vision and principles, as I mentioned, have really been the guiding framework to inform the scenarios and the work that we've done to date. So in working with the working group, and what we presented at the most recent update was that we will have 3 scenarios that we'll workshop. We did that. We've gone out for community feedback on those 3 scenarios. And where we need to get to now is coming up with a preferred scenario based on those 3 scenarios. And once that preferred scenario is finalised, we will then go into further community review and a detailed master plan post-September. So the purpose of tonight is to really give you the feedback on what those 3 scenarios were, and to provide some information around what we're going to be doing to shape that preferred scenario. So in terms of the community feedback that we actually received, we received detailed input from the working group, and thank you very much to all of you that participated and provided that information for us, which has been really invaluable. We had 105 completed surveys from the broader community, with the average age of participants around 35 to 44, which is reflective of the local demographic. It was also good to see there was a majority of East Vic Park and Vic Park residents, and 50% of the people that participated have actually not been previously involved in the exercise. So it's great to see that we're getting that broader reach of people involved. So in terms of how this feedback will be used, as I mentioned before, it's really going to shape that preferred scenario approach that we're going to be working up over the next couple of weeks. Once that preferred scenario is resolved, we'll go into, and it gets endorsed by council, presumably gets endorsed by council. We'll then go into the detailed master planning phase. And in the long term, it'll obviously continue to shape planning, placemaking and governance of the site into the future. So in terms of just the way I'm going to present the feedback that we've received tonight, we're going to firstly touch on some of the common elements and the overall feedback that we received. I'll then talk you through some of the individual scenario elements and the feedback specifically on each of those. And then we'll actually touch on how that feedback is going to influence the preferred scenario and the design directions. So what are the key elements around access, open space, facility design and other uses that we're taking out of each of the scenarios to prepare a preferred scenario. So in terms of the common elements, these figures actually relate to the feedback that was neutral through to support and strongly support. And as we've been proceeding through this exercise, there's been some really common themes that have been coming back time and time again. And not surprisingly, these came through as very strong through these common elements as well. So in terms of retaining the fig trees, preserving the full size of Macmillan Park, improving pedestrian access, and really keeping and providing the space for all existing community facilities has come through really strongly, as well as adding the more greenery and public space opportunities. Again, improving traffic flow and car parking has come back, which we can see. And interestingly, there was also 71% of people said they provided some support for some development to help fund the new facilities and open space enhancements. And again, safety and increasing activity during periods of night keeps on coming up as well. This here is actually a culmination of all of the different questions that we asked to provide overall feedback for each of the different scenarios. So if you actually filled in the survey, you would remember there was a whole series of questions around the different themes. This is the stats of each of those elements being brought together. So I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail over the next couple of minutes, but essentially scenario 2 really had the strongest level of support, with 58% of support across the board. Interestingly, between scenario 1 and scenario 3, there was a very close level of 48 and 49% of people strongly supported and supported those scenarios. So there wasn't that much difference, but there was actually a lot more people who were indifferent and neutral for scenario 1. We also asked a question, like just going back to the vision and principles, which scenario best reflects the vision? And scenario 3 actually came out on top in relation to that particular question. 9% of people said that none of the scenarios reflected the vision, and 5% of people actually said that all of the scenarios reflected the vision. So what I'm going to do now is just a bit of a recap as a reminder in terms of what the scenarios were, and then provide you with some specific feedback. So scenario one was really very much about minimising the non-community development and retaining the site's existing layout. This is very much about a moderate cost scenario. So it's moderate cost for town to increase the facilities and very much minimal development, so low cost, low funding generation. It was very much about rebuilding the leisure life and library pavilions in their current area, refurbishing and consolidating the bowls, and investing in a culture courtyard and beer garden in and around the arts precinct and the existing bowls facility. Now, in terms of feedback, we had 48% of people either strongly supported or supported the concept, 33% were neutral, and 19% opposed it. In terms of key feedback that we received, there was a mixture of views. People were generally supportive of the range of mix of uses that were on site, but there was mixed views in terms of the connections and in terms of whether or not to retain the bowls facility or not as well. Here's just a couple of quotes that came through in addition to the surveys as well. So again, quite diverging views. So some people supportive of scenario one and some people probably thinking it's not really ambitious enough. So opportunities for development with scale are limited and should be maximised. So while there will be some opposition, density increases should be focused around the strip and family homes maintained further away. But on the flip side of that, please do not allow private developments on the site. It's a community space and it should stay that way. There were some questions around the bowls, whether it's actually retaining the bowls in this location is actually necessary or not, and maybe there's options to consider relocation. And we'll come back to that as I proceed through the presentation. There's also some feedback about option 2 or 3 need to be really explored because option 1 was a wasted opportunity to really create a vibrant and connected legacy for the town centre. So this is just a summary of the feedback that we received again for each of those different elements across scenario 1. Here you can see that more people were very much opposed. There's people opposed, but also people that support and neutral, because this site was about limiting sale and development of council land. So there's differing views there. One of the recurring themes is really about whether the sale of land should be justified. So people were very much pragmatic about the building design and the specs. So there was actually some pretty good support for the building option in scenario 1. And in terms of spaces, there's some strong support here. And you'll recall there was the culture courtyard, as well as retaining the existing green space pretty much as is. But generally, people are reticent about the sale of council land unless there's clear benefit back to the community. In terms of some of the working group feedback, we heard that although it's not, it's okay, although it's not very inspired, it does, however, provide an option for those keen on a light touch approach. People really liked that courtyard feel and the fact that the arts precinct was remaining. They were quite happy for housing on Albany Highway, but thought that maybe there's potential for some hidden antisocial behaviour in and around the Bowls Club and that culture courtyard. In terms of scenario 2, this is very much about splitting the services. So it looked at the courts and the Bowls Centre being co-located together, but the library being relocated over to Albany Highway. So it's very much about mixing community and commercial services together, and also providing a bit of a frame for public activity around an expanded John Macmillan Park. So this was a moderate cost to town, as well as a moderate increase in development activities. So in terms of level of support, from the broad community perspective, this scenario 2 actually received the strongest support, with 58%, 20% were neutral and 22% were opposed to scenario 2. In terms of some of the key elements, the bowls in the park was an interesting notion. 53% of people actually supported the bowls being relocated into the green space, but 36% opposed it. So that's quite a divisive concept. A lot of people were generally opposed to deck parking, And people were generally supportive of the library design in terms of being having its own profile and a pride of place, but also in a location that's easily accessible to the broader public. In terms of some of the feedback that we received, I love the idea of providing as a space for aged care so those residents can be close and involved. I'm in favour of limiting the height of buildings as I'm concerned about shadows. So I think that the height of the buildings came through as a very strong theme as well. I'm concerned about obvious plans for extensive residential and other developments to 6 to 8 stories, should be a maximum of 3 to 4 stories. I think essentially the height is probably the compelling reason as to why scenario 2 actually received the strongest support. I believe in good design, great landscape amenity, and integrating as much greenery as possible will really put the town centre of Vic Park on the radar. And I think there should be a clear active transport concept. So transport, parking, transport management and parking has come through time and time again as a key issue as well. In terms of the general feedback for scenario 2, there's very much strong support for the split facilities. In terms of other, this is about housing, not-for-profit spaces and cafes into the park. So there is good support, but there's also opposing views there. And there was very strong support for the public spaces, which include the tree-lined promenade and the active piazza. This facilities here was very much about the bowls in the park and the library having pride of place on Albany Highway as well. Now, interestingly, although scenario 2 received strong support from the broader community, when it came to the working group, this was actually the least popular option. So some of the feedback we had from the working group was that the community uses should front the park, not dwellings. There was concern about the community facilities not linking together and wanting to make sure that there are those cross linkages and cross usage. And also some questions around the height of the sports hall being on the hill might be a little bit obtrusive. There was also some positive feedback about the library connecting to the strip. Other issues were about how those buildings function and also particularly the concerns around how each of those buildings interface with the public open space. In terms of scenario 3, this was very much about high cost, high revenue generation. So it really proposed that vertically stacked civic hub and town square within the site and really played up those public space, destinational playground and native garden opportunities throughout the site, as well as with housing and sustainability options. There was 49% support for this scenario. 13% of people were neutral and 38% opposed. But as I mentioned before, interestingly, this is the scenario which was more aligned to the vision than each of the scenarios that preceded it. In terms of the key feedback, people were generally supportive of the public spaces. There were big questions in relation to the building height. So people are generally opposed to building heights, anything over around 7, 8 stories and upwards. There was also quite a lot of questions in terms of the facility design. So it was very much mixed views. It was quite divisive in a sense where people either loved it or they hated it. So some people liked the idea. Some people thought that maybe spaces might be compromised if everything was put together in a stacked building. And likewise, there was also diverging and mixed views in relation to private development. Some people very supportive, other people very concerned about the heights that are actually proposed in this scenario. So some of the feedback, it's important that ratepayers are not burdened by increased investment in the area without a proper return, but it would create a superior precinct full of life and deliver increased spending and patrons for businesses along Albany Highway. The design of scenario 3 seems to be the most forward thinking and best utilisation of the space. However, I feel like the height limit is more in keeping with, of 5 or 6 stories is more in keeping with the area. And as I mentioned before, that concern around stacking all the facilities together and potentially meaning that you're actually going to be able to have to compromise on that space. And again, the fact that the library should really stand on its own as a proud entity across 3 levels with plenty of car parking. In terms of the feedback summary, as I mentioned before, in terms of the facilities, you can see here between strongly opposed and strongly support, there's very divisive opinions in relation to the vertically stacked facilities. And likewise, in terms of some of the other uses around housing, and I think the heights are very much at play here as well, aged care, eco-village, strong support, but also a lot of people strongly opposed. And this is where the public open space has received really strong support in terms of really dialing that up and creating a unique destination. So in terms of some of the working group feedback, my opinion is that it's hands down the most exciting and game-changing option. So I think a lot of people were very excited about the opportunities that this might provide in terms of vibrancy and really adding to the culture and the flavour of the area. But then a lot of people, there's the opposing views about not liking the fact that all the facilities are actually stacked into one massive building, and it could potentially be very Vic Park-like. So very much mixed views as we proceeded through. So I might just break here quickly and throw to Kev to see if there's been any questions, Kev.
Hi everybody, sorry I can't seem to get my camera working tonight, so you'll just have to imagine my face. Maybe it's a relief that you can't see me. We actually haven't got too many questions through yet, so I'd encourage everyone, there's that Q&A button. That should pop up with lots of cancel any questions that you have anyway. Also, questions will be answered already.
Right.
Starting with... Yes, Anna?
Sorry, that's you're just breaking up a bit. I think that was you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Great. So I just wanted to start with a question from Mike, which we said we'd answer. Just querying on the design of the scenarios, whether they all contained cafes and restaurants in the promenades around the park. And the answer to that was yes, but there was a scale there. So I think scenario one only maybe had one little cafe ramping up through the scenarios. The other questions that we received was also just querying the status of the gym and whether that was part of the concepts, and that's the same answer, that yes, the gym and all other facilities that are currently on the site. Part of the reference group, the working group's guidance to us was to make sure that all of those existing facilities have a home in each of the three scenarios. So the gym and all of those other uses like the childcare and others are all in each of those scenarios. So yeah, as I say, any other questions, please type away.
Have we got anything in the chat?
No. Just the Q&A is where we're asking for feedback at the moment.
All right, okay. So I'll keep moving then.
Actually, sorry to cut you off, Xander. I just neglected to cover off another question, just querying how the survey was constructed and whether we asked people, what scenario they preferred. And just to clarify there that we'd asked people directly to nominate which option they thought was the best reflection of the community's vision for the site. And then a lot of the numbers that you've been presenting tonight is where we've grouped together all of the feedback on individual questions to try and get an overall picture about how people feel about each scenario in general. So that's how we've gone about looking at that.
All right, thanks, Kev. So in terms of how this actually informed the preferred scenario direction, so I guess the key elements that we are going to draw out, this is really about the key elements that we're going to draw out to inform the preferred scenario. So there's a number of things that we need to consider. There's the range of different views amongst the working group as well as the wider community. We need to really be thinking about balancing the feedback with operational and cost considerations as well. We're aware that we won't be able to completely resolve some of the key issues, and some of that will continue through the detailed master planning phase. So things like facility design and cost and land use mix and funding are going to be ongoing issues we're going to have to continue to address. And we need to be thinking about identifying areas for further planning and consultation as well. So in terms of the key issues around, we did structure the survey under a number of different themes. So I'm just going to be touching on those themes now. So in terms of access and connections, scenario 3, pedestrian links and parking were really strongly supported. There was a lot of reticence around deck parking in scenario 2, and So a lot of people are actually concerned about the commercialisation of parking potentially in the future, and therefore it will be paid parking. In terms of the issues and the directions that we will consider, we'll be looking at refining and moderating the popular elements of scenario 3 around that fine-grained pedestrian and laneway network, really looking at basement parking and dual access to traffic management opportunities, exploring the interface connections with the surrounding streets, in particular Albany Highway and Sussex, and also looking at pedestrian passing connections around John Macmillan Park. For open space design, there was strong support for the playground and the nature gardens, but there was actually an element of support for less intensive upgrades. So you can see here, scenario 3 has very strong support here for the upgrades and the location, but there's also somewhat support for additional public spaces in the culture courtyard that was actually identified here in scenario 1. So we'll be looking at refining the elements of scenario 3 in terms of that activated Northern Park area with the playground and the native gardens, but really paring that down. So the level of intensity will be reconsidered, but we will be exploring ways to increase the number of new public spaces. In terms of the elements of scenario 1 and 2, we'll be looking at how we can really build on that symmetry in vista, which was well supported. So the formal character, the sight lines, preserving those flexible event spaces and really not overcrowding the spaces. So it'll be about bringing the best of each of those elements together. The issue, as I mentioned, as I touched on before, in terms of uses and heights, was quite a divisive one. So there were very much mixed views on height and design. Scenario 3, you can see here in the yellow, was the most opposed because of the level of heights. And heights and design in scenario 2 received the most support. So in response to that, we're going to be looking at reducing the building heights more aligned with option 2. One of the key areas, though, will be very much about looking at what the community benefit will actually be. So ensuring there is public benefit and prioritising the community uses, exploring the mid-rise, lower scale buildings and not necessarily towers, and looking at heights potentially between around 3 to 6 stories. So there is, as I mentioned before, there is an element of support for private development, but that really needs to be qualified against benefit. So that will be an important consideration as we move forward. In terms of the facility design, this again was very much divisive in terms of the scenario 3. So you can see here, there's mixed views on that stacked facility for scenario 3. So scenario 3 is in the yellow, and there's an element of strong support, but there's also a very strong element that's strongly opposed to it. And there's actually strong support in terms of splitting facilities for option 2 as well. So for scenario 2. So in terms of strong support here for the leisure life design and location. So in terms of the preferred scenario direction, we'll be looking at ways to situate facilities east of the park to really build on those linkages and collaboration, and look at ways to really connect the recreation and the community uses. But we haven't necessarily resolved what that design outcome is going to be, because it's very much linked to cost. And given that the community are reticent about the sale of land, cost implications are going to have to be very important. So what we're probably going to explore in the preferred scenario is 2 different design options. One being the stacked option with improved option 1. The option 1 where the facilities are split and grouped together. But once we do some more detailed planning, we can really get down to understand what the cost, what the function, the scale and character will be, and then come up with a detailed design. So in terms of the stacked option, that will actually explore ways in terms of the ground floor library community, and then potentially the leisure life on the second floor. The rooftop bowls was actually well received, but the issue is obviously cost. So we're really keen to continue to explore that and understand if it is actually feasible and viable. And this really will leverage the opportunity to get that activity spilling out into the park. But the other option that we're proposing really will look at that grouped option. So rather than stacking all the facilities together, potentially looking at splitting them across 2 facilities. And that will potentially provide the opportunity for the library and the community to really be connected with the leisure life, but single level or lower height over a larger area, which will provide the opportunity for a basement car park, potentially, which will address the car parking issues that were raised by the community. It will address it will provide opportunities for that common circulation and co-location. And as part of this, we'll also explore bowls in the park or potentially elsewhere. So that's going to be another live issue that we'll need to work through the ongoing engagement over the next couple of months. So this grouped option will be similar to scenario 1, with the facilities being side by side, but a higher quality outcome. So funding was the other issue that was explored through the survey, and we very much had feedback around the need to balance the sale of land against other funding sources. So it's not just about providing funding specific to the site. So the community are very much open to looking at revenue opportunities on the site as well, but there needs to be that balance. So you see here in terms of scenario 3, there is actually some strong support there, but there's also an element of neutral support for scenario 1 and somewhat support for scenario 1 and scenario 2 as well. So what we're proposing to do is really look at the detailed costings and funding opportunities through the detailed master planning phase, identify opportunities to really prioritise external funding, and look at ways to link the development to facility funding and community benefits. So the community, there was a lot of feedback about whether the sale of land is really worth it. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to explore as we proceed. And we also need to be thinking about what those broader economic impacts and whole of life costs are actually going to be, and the wow factor and the impact that that the development could bring to the broader area. So in terms of the summary of the key elements that we're going to be exploring through the preferred scenario, it's really about combining elements of each of the options. So it won't be one particular scenario. So in terms of access connections, we'll be looking at that fine-grained pedestrian network and linking the park back to the highway. In terms of public open space, we will be exploring adding new amenities, but also preserving those formal qualities of the open lawned area. We'll be keeping an open and flexible approach in terms of the 2 design options for the community facilities, so they can be further explored through the detailed design phase. In terms of other uses, we'll be looking at a reduced building height and scale and thinking about how we can make that general transition back to the park, and exploring a pragmatic approach to funding the site and making sure that that is actually linked back to community benefit. Have we got any questions, Kev?
Only a few, which I'm happy to run through. But again, if anyone has heard anything just through that portion of the presentation that they had any questions or comments on, please just pop open the Q&A tab there and feel free to share your comments. We had another quick clarification from Renee, just asking where the Arts Centre got to in scenario 3. And just to confirm that was partially kept in its existing building, but expanded into additional cottages with maybe more performance and event space incorporated. Let me just have a quick look at any other questions that we've had come through. A question about the potential to mix scenarios together, and I think based on your comments there, Xander, well, I think we've outlined that we are doing a bit of a Frankenstein of several of the options.
All right, there's also how can we make sure that access to space for all the community will be carried through to the planning stage. One of the key elements that we'll be looking at through the detailed master planning phase is also that the town is going to be looking at a community needs analysis to really understand what the needs and facilities are for the community, and making sure those elements are actually confirmed to actually inform the final design. And Jack, have I answered? Yeah. Hopefully I've answered that, May.
Just another question looking to clarify, just making sure there'll be a level of detail around land areas and ownership details and the particulars of what is being proposed, and making sure all of that is mapped and presented to ratepayers when we get to that next stage of planning. And I think the town's confirmed there that definitely, yes, if the community finds that valuable, we'll make sure all of that information is published and made available for review.
All right. So have we got any other questions that are coming through? Or do you think we should wrap it up? Hang on. How did the town come up with the open space increases? This seems a bit odd. Does Kev or Andrew want to answer that? Sorry, Andrew, can you answer that? Because I think Kev's, yeah.
Sure. It was a combination of factors, really. A large factor was the community desire to retain trees on the site. So we've done that in a series of open spaces, and also in response to feedback that the community would like to see a variety of different open spaces. So not just the one larger space, but smaller spaces to perform more civic functions and have that variety of experiences throughout the precinct.
If you can hear me okay, I might just add that a key design element that seemed to receive quite broad support was the idea of a sequence of open spaces, kind of moving from Albany Highway through to the park, through to Gloucester Street. So creating those additional smaller open spaces, we've progressed almost as part of a journey through the site. We've also got another question just querying whether, regardless of the scenario that's adopted, if it will include SEPTED or crime prevention through environmental design requirements. A great question, and an issue that's been really clearly raised by the community as a concern in terms of how the area functions today. So all of the design scenarios that we've developed, and Andrew, I might throw it to you in a second, just to clarify, have really had that front of mind in how they design the park, the sight lines through the park, how the buildings meet the edge of the park, things of that nature.
Yeah, and also particular attention at ground level to make sure that we maximise the number of entries and I guess eyes on the street, not only at ground level but also at upper levels through housing. And that's, I guess, one of the benefits of housing is it gives you eyes on the street at different times of the day to other uses. So it's that around the clock passive surveillance that we're really looking for.
A few other questions rolling in. One, querying whether there will be any hireable office space for tenants or for flexible use. That's certainly something we've been exploring, particularly in relation to the Sussex Street Law Centre, who we know need office space, and it's definitely a use that we're contemplating, something with some real community benefit there to explore. And definitely a potential candidate for that ground floor activity that Andrew was speaking to. The question is also querying whether there was any provision made for an outdoor cinema screen, such as in Northbridge Piazza. And I think that is something we've been prospectively looking at in option 3, worked into that stacked community hub there. But of course, we'll have to have a look at the dollars involved before we can make any formal commitment to that. I think we had another question there querying whether the sale of town land would be looked at as a means of funding community facility development, other council land property, pardon me. And I believe the position there is that it's a consideration we'll be looking at and exploring the town's other land assets, but it's ultimately going to be unlikely that there'll be enough land available to cover the costs of these kinds of facilities fully. without compromising other competing objectives around the town. So it'll be part of the mix, part of a broader balance that we'll have to look at further. A few more questions coming in as well. Feel free to jump on those, Xander, if you had any. I think
yeah, no, you're right. Keep going, Kev. You're doing a good job.
I think we have one there, just that regardless of the option chosen, what kind of timeframes we can be looking at. And I think that's really yet to be established, something we really have to bed down in this next phase of detailed planning in terms of how long things will take to transition, what kind of staging we might have to account for to make sure that services aren't interrupted over that period. But I do recall broadly we're looking at a 10 to 15 year horizon when some of the identified costs and upgrade works in existing facilities come to be realised, and we need to start making some change. So maybe that might be an indicative time frame for now, and we'll make sure that we bed that down with some specific dates going forward.
There's a question, and I'm not quite sure what is actually being asked, but it's saying in terms of more building, selling public land and more open space looks wrong for the same area of land. Are you now counting private space as open? So I'm not sure if that's talking about the public open spaces and the lawned area or public domain. I don't know if it's a clarification in terms of the public open space within the development areas. Yeah,
it's I guess the key change that we're making in these scenarios compared to how the site is today, which is what that kind of change is comparing itself to, is kind of really rationalising the area of non-public spaces around the site today. So for example, the car park on Albany Highway, the parking areas around the site, and particularly the footprint of the existing bowls club, and rationalising the overall area of that allows us to increase the amount of public spaces across the site and kind of create a more formal public space network. Some of those places might be quite green today, but they don't really have an open space function. So that's the change that we're proposing in these scenarios.
There's also a question around whether state and federal government funding to lessen rate increases is actually being discussed. I think that the whole point has been exploring ways for a whole host of external funding opportunities. So it's been identified, and it was identified at the working group as something that the community would be keen to explore. But because we're not at the point of, we haven't done the detailed master planning, we haven't actually gone into that detail yet, but it's definitely on the radar and a key consideration.
And I think certainly the feedback that we've received from the broader community and the working group is that I guess the amount of theoretical land to be sold within the site to fund all of these community facilities isn't supported. They wouldn't like to see that much land sale and development occur, which then really obliges us to look at state and federal funding, other council revenue, external grants, and those other funding means to contribute to this infrastructure.
There's also a question in terms of the delivery timetable, regardless of the final option that's been chosen.
Did we cover that one off?
Oh, you may have. Sorry if I missed that. All right. Are there any other questions or comments or anything that people would like us to further explain?
A key question there, just raising the issue of climate change and how that's being designed into the spaces, services, obviously the long-term function of all of these facilities going forward. Very much a key point of feedback that we've heard from the community and the working group. And I suppose there's a range of detailed strategies which we can reference and touch on at this stage, but will require some more detailed thinking and work as we look to things such as a detailed community facility architectural design, where we might incorporate sustainable building principles there, detailed landscaping design, where we need to be looking at native or climate change tolerant species and the use of water and things such as that. So it's definitely an issue that we've heard is important and one that we'll be incorporating into the following phases of planning.
It came sustainable built form, and it came through very, very strongly through the working group discussions as well.
And also reducing the heat island effect by increasing the urban forest canopy as much as possible.
So there's a question around whether Hawaiian has participated in this webinar or indicated they wish to be consulted. Hawaiian were actually were on the working group. They were a member of the working group, and we've had some meetings with them offline as well. So we have actually been discussing with them as part of this process. And there's also a question around, will there be electrical charging stations for electric cars? I think that's a good question. We haven't gone down to that level of detail at this point, but I think it's a great consideration that can be included.
There's a question there around biophilic design, which is a great one around that broader topic of climate change. And biophilic design is basically where buildings are mimicking nature, I guess. And I think, yeah, that's a really exciting opportunity that we'd like to explore going forward.
A key question there around the level of support for some of the alternate land uses or complementary uses that were explored in the draft scenarios, noting that there was a low level support for things such as aged care and housing in some of the initial surveys that we conducted back in February. And that's definitely a very valid point and something we'll be working through in terms of which uses are most appropriate and how the community feels about those potential uses. But it has been interesting to see in some of the latest feedback we've been looking at a much higher level of support for some of those initiatives. And I think it was in excess of 70% of the survey respondents suggesting that they'd be happy to see some balance there between those other uses to help fund this new infrastructure and public space. But definitely no uses have been confirmed at this stage, and anything that does occur on the site into the future will be subject to the usual amount of community consultation and detailed planning.
And there is a comment there around taking into consideration the preferred aspects of across the three scenarios, and not just focusing necessarily on housing and aged care. And I think that's a great point. And we have had a lot of feedback about what whatever investment there is, there needs to be that community benefit. So that's definitely something that we're striving to do, and we'd be interested to get continuing feedback to make sure that those all of the key elements that benefit the community will stay on the radar. So there's also a question around why the town is trying to do a redevelopment scheme here when there's so much undeveloped and vacant land on Albany Highway and competing with the existing ratepayers for rents. And I guess this comes back to the core of the project in terms of the fact that it is town land and the facilities are ageing, and looking at different funding models and options to actually be able to reinvest back into the community.
I think that's a very good point. I think we've heard that there's little appetite in the community for development for development's sake. And I think the approach that we've taken with the working group so far has really been, it's about planning for public space. It's about planning for the kind of community facilities that we'd like and getting that right. And then any other development, we're really only contemplating in terms of how it could help contribute to that funding or what other benefits it might bring to the wider community in the local area.
And the feedback we've had is that the uses need to be community related uses, and that the issue about competing with existing ratepayers and existing businesses is a real issue that needs to be taken into consideration.
I think we're fast approaching 7, but a final few comments that have been coming through. Room for the TGIF markets in those scenarios, definitely. I think we're looking to increase that amount of unstructured green space to be as flexible and usable as possible for those kinds of more ephemeral events. Will the library have a local history section? Definitely something we've heard as a popular idea, heard from the librarians themselves, in fact, but that might be a detailed matter that we'll have to look at going forward. What else have we got? Addressing matters of homelessness raised. Again, a common element of feedback. And I guess the various strategies for dealing with that issue are complex and multifaceted, but we have been approaching this in terms of activation and use and crime prevention through environmental design broadly, but it would probably require some more targeted strategies to address that going forward.
There's also a question around a performance theatre as well, and I think that's an interesting use which has been on the radar as well, and I think will definitely need to be considered and incorporated in terms of understanding feasibility and need, and whether it is actually a viable opportunity.
I'm not sure where the question's gone, but I did see one come through just querying how the community and the working group will be engaged and consulted going forward. Xandra, if you wanted to touch on that one.
Yes, and I think that was in terms of the master planning process, I think, when I saw that. We will need to, I guess the detailed master planning is a separate process, but there will definitely be a community engagement element that needs to be incorporated, but it's probably going to be more targeted. There will be elements that will need to be more targeted. So we will come back to the members of the working group and let them know once actually that has been resolved. There is another working group meeting that will be held in the next couple of weeks as we go into finalise the preferred scenario before it goes to council and public advertising as well.
And so, yeah, I think without wishing to preempt the detailed consultation planning that still needs to be undertaken there.
Yeah.
I think if this phase is really that kind of broad visioning and planning, I think we can expect that the consultation will be more focused and detailed as we go forward. Maybe it might talk about how a particular building functions and its uses and its design, or similar questions about open space or other sites. So some more detailed and focused engagement perhaps going forward.
Okay, do you think we should wrap it up for next steps? It's 7 o'clock. Are you happy with that, Kev? No more questions?
I don't see any more coming through, but as always, yourthoughts.victoriapark.wa.gov.au/MPM. We do have a comment box there. If you did have any other queries or questions, you can get in touch with us there.
So as I mentioned at the start, this is by no means the end of the of your opportunity to provide feedback. We're going to be going back to the working group and getting and council over the next couple of weeks. We'll then be going out to get some feedback on the preferred scenario in August. So there is another opportunity. So tonight's really just been a snapshot of what the community has been and the elements that we're looking at potentially taking into consideration to shape the preferred scenario. But there is that opportunity for you to provide detailed feedback in August. After that, we will then be going to council in the preferred scenario will go to council in September, and presuming that gets endorsed, we'll then move on to the detailed master plan phase, which will run from September through to 2021. And that will really look at, again, the detailed master planning, but also further consultation. So we'll be back in touch with a more detailed program at that point as well. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Apologies again for the IT hiccups that we had at the start of the session. But very much appreciate your time, and also to everyone that actually participated in the feedback through this process. We look forward to any more comments or questions if you've got them on the Your Thoughts website, and getting feedback again in August once we go out again for further feedback. Thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
Good evening.